Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Great. Well, thank you all for coming in today. For those of you who are regulars for History for Lunch, I'm taking over today for the month of October for Lori Meads, who is out today. For those who don't know who I am, I'm Andrew Nelson Redondo. I'm the exhibitions designer for the Museum of Albemarle, and it's a pleasure to be your host today. Before we begin, for those of you who are attending both in person and virtually, those virtually, I ask that you all do mute your audio so that you are not picked up. There will be a small moment for questions and answers at the end of Dr. Dunstan's presentation, but he has asked that he will only be taking questions from those here in public. As a reminder, for our next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, October 20th at 12 p.m. This will be with Dr. Melissa Stuckey of Elizabeth City State University. In conjunction with the Navigating Jim Crow, the Green Book and Oasis Spaces in North Carolina's traveling exhibition, which is upstairs on the second floor of the museum. Dr. Stuckey is going to be discussing about two of our regional businesses that were located in Elizabeth City that are and were listed in the Green Book during that era. I will be introducing here now Don Pendergraft. He's our regional director for the Museum of the Albemarle and Regional Museums North Carolina. Dr. Don Pendergraft, and thank you.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to see all of you out in a beautiful day in Elizabeth City. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce a man who has written a lot about Elizabeth City because he is a local boy from the town. He grew up here, and we have recently mounted an exhibit about the mysterious disappearance of Nell Cropsey. And Dr. William E. Dunstan will be giving a speech or a lecture today on some of his writings and some of his research. He is a visiting scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his comprehensive professional journey includes achievements as an architect or an archivist at the Virginia, let me put my glasses on, hold on. Yeah, he's an archivist at the Virginia State Archives, managing editor of the History Quarterly, Virginia Cavalcade, and editor of historical publications at the National Archives, which is a very big thing. He earned his doctorate in history at Carnegie Mellon University and later completed postdoctoral research at Harvard University. Dr. Dunstan has taught at Carnegie Mellon University, Brevard College, North Carolina State University, and the University of North Carolina. The Chronicle of Higher Education hailed him as an innovative historian and author. His 6-volume memoir, Ventures of the Southern Boyhood, centers on his exciting school days in Elizabeth City. His 2 books covering the strange story of Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox peel back secrets from the fractured Elizabeth City of 1901. 3 of Dr. Dunstan's books explore the historical, social, and cultural footprints of the ancient world. His other publications include 3 novels. He recently completed his 4th novel, Michael's Secret, introducing readers to an English-born Russian prince falling in love with a young noblewoman in 1909 Cornwall. But can this secret romance survive deadly Russian anarchists is the question. The Irish novelist and author Jason O'Toole has edited the manuscript. The novel should be published next year. In the meanwhile, Dr. Dunstan has started a 5th novel, Monty Against the Storm, set in an unusual independent school in 1922 Devonshire. So thank you very much. And I would like now welcome Dr. William Dunstan.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Well, it's wonderful to see such a large crowd here today, considering the pandemic. And you're all very brave to come out to hear what I have to say. Today, we're linked to people around the globe because this is being broadcast online. And we greet also the people who are watching us from other states and other countries. I'm so glad that you can be with us today. You know, we're so linked in life, and I believe that we're also linked in death. I stopped on the way here from Chapel Hill today to the museum in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, to speak to my great-grandmother in Windsor, North Carolina. She rests in the Episcopal Church yard there, and I always stop and greet her. And I'd ask her, please, to be with me today. As a matter of fact, my great-grandmother, Mary Louisa Vaughan Dunstan, she was in a massacre when she was 8 years old. So she knew about tragedy. She survived that massacre in Virginia. But she died exactly when this story was taking place, the story that we're gathered together today to talk about, the story, the woeful story of Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox. I have written 2 books about this story, and if I can make this work.
Down there.
All right, I've got it. Thank you. Okay. The second book that I wrote is Haunted, Jim Wilcox Remembers Nell Cropsey. That is a nonfiction novel. It's based on the facts, and yet I have had to imagine Jim Wilcox's conversations. These conversations I have based upon court records and testimony of people who heard Jim Wilcox speak and who heard Nell Cropsey speak. So I believe that you can depend on this book as an accurate book, even though I have imagined conversations. The first book that I wrote, Jim Wilcox and Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox, The Kill of Destiny. That book is almost 600 pages long, and it is as much about the history of Elizabeth City and Pasquotank County as it is about Jim Wilcox and Nell Cropsey. You can learn everything you wish to know about the climate, the political climate, the cultural climate during the days of Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox. Now, in 1876, a little boy was born in Pasquotank County, southern Pasquotank County. For those of you around the world who may not know where Pasquotank County is, it's in northeastern North Carolina. That's where we are today. We're in the county seat here of Elizabeth City. Southern Pasquotank County stretches all the way down to the vast Albemarle Sound. And so this little boy was born within sight of the vast Albemarle Sound. He was born to Tom Wilcox, who was a register of deeds. And the Wilcoxes owned vast stretches of land in southern Pasquotank County. They were highly respected people. They were Unionists on the verge of the Civil War. Many people in southern Pasquotank County at that time were Unionists. Elizabeth City, far fewer Unionists. But in southern Pasquotank County, there were many Unionists. The Wilcox family was highly respected. They had been in Pasquotank County, we know, since the days of early settlement. Their deeds go back to the 1740s. Now here you can see the vast Albemarle Sound, and on a good day, on a clear day, you stand on the banks of the Pasquotank, the banks of Pasquotank County, you can see in the distance, you can see the Outer Banks. And on a very good day, you can see even the Wright Memorial. A happy family, a prosperous family, a progressive family. They were Republicans. Now, unlike today, the Republican Party was the Progressive Party, and the Democratic Party was the Conservative Party. So the Democratic Party in this period was a party of white supremacists. The white supremacists were trying to wrest control of the state from the Republicans. The Republicans wanted a more egalitarian society. Not so with the Democrats. They wanted to deny people of color the right to vote. They wanted to suppress them. And this becomes very apparent when you read the newspapers of this period. I spent a long time reading all the newspapers published in this town in the late 19th century and the early 20th century so that I could understand the story, because the story baffled me. Now, if you lived in Elizabeth City in the late 19th century, land transportation was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. The roads were dirt, they were rutty. You had to go through swampland. It was just a very difficult ordeal to travel anywhere by land. But in 1805, the Dismal Swamp Canal had opened. The Dismal Swamp Canal connects Norfolk and Elizabeth City. And so ships could go from the Chesapeake Bay through the Dismal Swamp Canal to Elizabeth City, down the Pasquotank River, to the Albemarle Sound, and on to points south. So here is a beautiful view of the locks on the Dismal Swamp Canal in the days of Jim and Nell. Probably one of the first memories in little Jim Wilcox's life came when the train finally reached Elizabeth City. The train didn't reach Elizabeth City until 1881. The reason for that is because the terrain was so difficult. So whereas train tracks crisscrossed North Carolina before the Civil War, they did not reach Elizabeth City until 1881. And you can imagine how exciting that must have been for little Jim Wilcox, 5 years old, when his parents carried him to town from southern Pasquotank County to see the arrival of the first train. This train was met with cannon fire. Bands played, speeches were given. And little Jim gained an idea of the prominence of his family and his father when so many people came up to greet him before the train arrived. And imagine what it must have been like for little Jim to see this big, black, powerful locomotive with steam hissing and smoke pluming into the air, bells ringing. Imagine that, and the earth shaking. This great train finally reached Elizabeth City. Now, the original depot, when Jim was a boy, was on the Pasquotank River. And so here we can see the original depot on the river. The reason the depot was on the river was so that steamers could reach the train and passengers from the train could then go elsewhere. Here is a steamer noose. The steamer noose met the train, and people could go on the steamer noose down the Pasquotank River into the Albemarle Sound and on beyond to New Bern and other points. Well, By 1885, Jim's father, as I said, he was a registrar of deeds. He decided that his life would be much easier if he didn't have to drive or he didn't have to take a horse 10, 12 miles north to Elizabeth City to be the registrar of deeds. And so they moved to Elizabeth City. Now, as you can see here, this is Main Street at that time. At that time, the streets were all dirt. There were no paved streets. Even in my boyhood, there were streets that were dirt. And the paved streets were paved with bricks. But in his day, they were all dirt. Although a few years later, they started putting oyster shells down on some of the streets. Now, this is the house they occupied on Shepherd Street. This is the way it looked. This is the way the house looked in 1901. This was a beautiful house. Shepherd Street was a prestigious street in 1901. Dr. Paleman John lived on Shepherd Street. He was a publisher of the North Carolinian, which was a Republican progressive newspaper. You could reach the Episcopal Cemetery on Shepherd Street. This was a desirable address. And you can see this is a Victorian house with many ornaments. Now the house was remodeled about 20 years later. This is the way it looks now. There's the same house that's still standing. So if you want to see Jim Wilcox's house, when you leave the museum today, you can make a right turn on Shepherd Street and you will see his house, beautiful house. The big day for Jim Wilcox came in 1888 when the city finally bought the first steam fire engine. It was called the Inez. And here you can see the Inez battling a fire. Imagine that. Before they had the Inez, fighting a fire was very difficult. But this Inez, it could shoot water hundreds of feet. It was an amazing instrument. And it went racing to fires, bell clanging, horses pulling it, everybody in town running after it to see what the fire was, where it was. And Jim Wilcox, when he was older, he became a volunteer fireman. He served without pay, volunteer fireman. And I'll tell you something, a little secret about Jim Wilcox. He had been teased for years after he came to town because he was only about 5 feet tall. And boys can be unmerciful. So they were unmerciful with him. They had nicknames for him, Shorty, Squatty. He developed a thick skin. He seemed to have a stony indifference to times of crisis. But of course he hurt within. We can be sure he did, but he never showed it. He never showed emotion. He guarded his emotions. You know why he liked to be a volunteer fireman? For one thing, he was doing a service, an amazing service, without pay. And for another thing, height didn't matter at a fire. Bravery did. That's what mattered, bravery. But he was a brave firefighter. Now, of course, Jim Wilcox, like all boys, he loved the local attractions. The Elizabeth City Fair, for example. In 1891, they advertised in the newspaper that a man would rise to the clouds in a balloon and he would then have a parachute jump. People could not believe this. This seemed like a death-defying act. And so everyone went to see this. Of course, in 1890 and 1891, this man came down with that mishap. although in one case, the wind blew him off to a distant field, and it took him some time to find his way back to town. At any rate, he was not cut or bruised or harmed. Well, what about electricity?
What about it?
Electricity came to town very, very slowly. It was supposed to come in 1889. But electric lights were on for about a half an hour, then they went off. They needed a new generator. They got a new generator, it was faulty. Then they got another one. They forgot the pulley. This went on and on until 1892. From 1889 to 1892, there was no reliable electricity. And at first, it was just in the business district. As a matter of fact, in the days of Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox, there was no electricity on Riverside Avenue where she lived. And I'll talk about her in a minute. But suppose you wanted to keep your food cool so it would not spoil. They did not have electric refrigerators. They had wooden refrigerators. Ice would be put on one side, and that would keep the food cool. Well, so once electricity has been established, we can have an ice plant. We can have an ice plant so that people can be supplied with ice. And here's an ad for the ice plant. Well, you can see the director of the ice plant is W.E. Dunstan. That's my grandfather, and his name was William Edward Dunstan. I am named for him. I'm the third. He was the first. So this ice plant was an amazing marvel with compressors and all sorts of machineries, evaporators, and it changed life dramatically in Elizabeth City. You could hear the ice wagons going up and down the streets, their bells jingling. It was a godsend, the ice plant. My grandfather's here on the right. This is at the time of his wedding. He married in 1895. He married Emma Sawyer. She was young enough to be his daughter. No one thought the marriage would last, but of course, marriages did last in those days. You did not dare dissolve a marriage at that time. But at any rate, from all I can gather, the marriage was satisfactory. And they built or bought a magnificent house on West Church Street. And I spent many a day in that house with my grandmother when I was a little boy. The house burned to the ground in 1966, unfortunately. But that is where my grandfather and grandmother lived. Now, the reason I bring this up for two reasons. Reason number one is their firstborn child was Fleetwood Dunstan. Uncle Fleetwood, who was born in 1896, became best friends with Camden Blades. And Camden Blades was a cousin of Jim Wilcox. So many things have been written about Jim Wilcox that are not true. Jim Wilcox was related to the Blades family, the Foreman family, the Robinsons family, the Hollowells, the Markhams. He was related to some of the most notable families of Elizabeth City. He came from a highly respected family, and I can tell you, his teachers noticed that he was artistically brilliant, but even more important to the teachers, he was mechanically brilliant. He loved technology. After he died, three people who knew him, three men who went to school with him, came to the Daily Advance, our local newspaper, at the time of his death. And they said that had he been placed in a Westinghouse laboratory or an Edison laboratory, he could have become a brilliant inventor and scientist. Thomas Edison was Jim Wilcox's hero. He went to a private school founded by Samuel Lloyd Sheep. Samuel Lloyd Sheep came to Elizabeth City from Pennsylvania after the Civil War. Many, many people came to Elizabeth City from Pennsylvania after the Civil War, including Jim Wilcox's own mother and her father and her mother. They came from Pennsylvania, as did Dr. Palaman John, the publisher of the North Carolinian. So there were many people here from Pennsylvania, and they really enriched this town in so many ways. They brought new ideas, new customs, new thoughts. Samuel Lloyd Sheep, he was a great educator, and Jim studied in his school. Well, the telephone finally came to town. It came to town in 1896. And so imagine the telephone. People could be linked to one another electronically with the telephone. My grandfather's telephone at the ice company was number 16. So he had one of the first telephones. Well, Jim Wilcox's uncle, another man from Pennsylvania, P.W. Mellick. By the way, he went to Princeton Theological Seminary. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He was a former school teacher, and he opened a very prosperous company, Mellick's, on Water Street. He sold furniture and house furnishings. Well, at the Mellick Company, all you had to do was tell the operator to connect you with number 34. So he had an early telephone. At any rate, because of his great promise, Jim Wilcox did something that was rather rare at the time. In 1897, Jim Wilcox enrolled at what became North Carolina State University in Raleigh. And he studied science and engineering and so forth. He was there for 1 year. He came home, he squared his shoulders, and he went to a local marine railway. The railways, the marine railways, they were on the river. There were several of them. Ships were hauled up on rails, that's why it's called a railway, and they were repaired. So many ships were coming down the Dismal Swamp Canal. They also built ships, and he was a vital member of the staff there because he had been trained in Raleigh at what became North Carolina State University. And that's the way the campus looked. Well, as I say, anything about technology fascinated Jim. And Thomas Edison was his hero. Thomas Edison had invented the phonograph as well as the incandescent light bulb. And so, of course, when the phonograph finally came and the gramophone, when they came to Elizabeth City, when they were available, people flocked to Hathaway's jewelry store because they actually sold them. They would come in and have a demonstration, and then they would buy a gramophone or a phonograph. Okay, now this is a newspaper clipping from The Economist. There were 3 newspapers at this time. One was the North Carolinian, the Progressive Republican newspaper. The second newspaper was The Economist. It was published by Colonel Richard Denbury Creasy. He was not a colonel. He gave himself the title colonel. Many people who consider themselves important in those days bestowed the title colonel upon themselves. I can tell you, it's very difficult for me to read The Economist. When I go back and read those old copies of The Economist, which I did every issue when I did my research, it was very hard for me to read it because he's a white supremacist. He is adamant that people of color should not vote, that they should have no rights. He didn't even want to see people from Hungary or Italy come to Elizabeth City. Some of the things that he wrote, I would not repeat in polite conversation. And he could get away with that. But now here is something rare. Jim Wilcox's father was a progressive Republican. And Colonel Creasy has this in his paper. Thomas P. Wilcox, High Sheriff of the county, entertained his friends at his hospitable house on Shepherd Street on Tuesday night. This is 1896. Okay, everyone knew that Sheriff Wilcox, and by the way, he's now sheriff, everyone knew, and he ran and he had a great victory. Everyone knew that Mr. Wilcox was a man of great respect and honor. And so even in this democratic, conservative, white supremacist newspaper, he mentions this, his hospitable home. Well, Elizabeth City was on a roll in terms of buildings. Buildings were going up everywhere. A fairly new building here is a Lorry building on the right, and Mitchell's Beehive department store is down at the bottom. And then you can see above that, a great deal of space. That was for the Opera House. Now, that was not an opera house in a traditional sense. An opera house at that time simply meant a place where you could go and hear vaudeville or plays,
Come here,
comedy,
Phoebe.
musicians, you could go for seances, all sorts of things. It was a place of entertainment. And that building is going to play a major role in Jim Wilcox's story, which you will see if you read my books.
Come here, Phoebe.
Okay, now,
Phoebe.
1898. Jim's life is going to change radically in 1898. A new family comes to town, the Cropsey family. This story, the rest of this story, is going to destroy both families, the Cropsey family and the Wilcox family. Completely, utterly destroy them. It will destroy two people, Jim Wilcox and Nell Cropsey. At any rate, her family comes to town. Why does he come to town? He comes from Brooklyn. He has rented land in Brooklyn for years. He has rented a home in Brooklyn. He's never owned a home, and he's never owned land. But he has been corresponding with John B. Fearing. John B. Fearing. Let me show you his house. This is John B. Fearing's house on Riverside Avenue. John B. Fearing is an extremely wealthy man. He's also a womanizer. He has been writing to Mr. Cropsey, promising him that he can bring in 2 crops a year if he rents land from Mr. Fury. And not only can he bring in 2 crops a year, the labor here is dirt cheap. Dirt cheap. All you have to do is pay the field hands enough money to keep them alive. That's it. So with these promises, of course, Mr. Cropsey comes to Elizabeth City and he brings his wife and his children. Now, this is something that really shocked me a lot. When I did my research, I discovered the Cropsey family lied about everything. You can't believe anything they say. They lied about their ages, for example. Let's just consider one daughter, Ollie Cropsey. Ollie Cropsey, Nell's sister. She, in the 1910 census, took 10 years from her life. She made herself 10 years younger. In the 1940 census, when she was 61, she claimed to be 40. Nell's brother, Will Cropsey, he always lowered his age. Her brother, Duke Cropsey, some of you may have known Duke Cropsey. He lowered his age by 2 years because when people ask him, what did he remember about Nell Cropsey and Jim Wilcox, he would always say, I was too young to remember, but he wasn't. He lowered his age by 2 years. He lowered his age by 2 years on his tombstone. Ollie Cropsey lowers her age by 6 years on her tombstone. Nell Cropsey lowered her age by 1 year. She told Jim that she was 1 year younger than she was. He told her his accurate age. At any rate, rumors soon swirled that Nell Cropsey and John B. Fearing were engaged in a romance. Well, he was much older, much older, and he was married. This would be a taboo romance. But the story persists. I didn't know whether to even put this in my books or not until I got a telephone call from a woman in Elizabeth City, a woman who happened to be a local historian, a genealogist, highly respected person. She had married into the Fearing family. So she calls me for an interview. She says she will not discuss it on the phone. So I drive from Chapel Hill to Elizabeth City, 3 hours and 20 minutes. I meet with her in her home. And boy, does she curl my hair with her story. She tells me that everyone in the Fearing family knew that John B. Fearing was involved in a relationship with Nell Cropsey. Everyone in the family knew it. And she said, half the people in town knew it. And she said, I just want to set this record straight. Such a terrible injustice has been done to Jim Wilcox. I just want to set the record straight. I said, may I use your name in my book? No, you may not. Well, your name is no good if I cannot use it in the book. So I go and I talk to a friend of mine, Buddy Shealy. I say, I have this wonderful bit of information, but I can't use it because she will not allow me to use her name. He said, get someone to go with you, have her repeat the story, and then say that in the company of so-and-so, she repeated the same information. I said, great, buddy, let's go. Oh, no. I'm not going with you. I'm not going to have my name in the book. But then I happened to mention this Beverly Small, the late Beverly Small, a dear friend. Beverly Small said, I'll go with you and you can use my name. Don't hesitate to use it. So off we go. I have my fingers crossed. Suppose she won't repeat the story. So I arrived at her home. I said, I just want to verify what you said the last time we met. She said, well, what did I say? And I said, well, I wrote it down word for word. She said, let me see it. So I showed it to her. She read it out loud. And she said, oh, yes, this is all correct. So I had my source. I had someone that I could put in the book. Beverly Small went with me, and she heard this. Unfortunately, you can't ask her now because she rests in the cemetery. However, she told me that many people had asked her about it. And she was a great help to me in so many ways in giving me information about the Wilcoxes and the Cropseys. Beverly Small was. This is a room inside the John B. Fearing house. And you can see it's decorated for Christmas. Now here is a portrait of Jim Wilcox about this time. Jim Wilcox was not a handsome man. Nell Cropsey was not a beautiful woman. I've looked at her pictures many times. I thought, how could anyone say that she was beautiful? But I wanted to find someone who knew her, who would say that. And finally, I found a letter. I found a letter written by the wife of a justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And in the letter, she quoted Maud Kramer Harris, who actually remembered Nell Cropsey. And she said she was anything but beautiful, and she could not understand how people could twist and turn the truth so much. So these are two plain-looking people. However, there is no doubt in my mind that Jim loved Nell Cropsey. As far as I can tell, he had never courted anyone until he met her. He was a lonely boy, brilliant but lonely. I believe that he loved her deeply, but unfortunately, she tormented him. Now, we see scenes like this, and we're expected to believe this was an idealistic romance of some sort. No, she really tormented Jim. The reason I know this is because of testimony in court, in which we actually know what she said to him on various occasions. On one occasion, he was leaving her house after visiting for the evening, and he was moving a little bit too slow to suit her. She should have said nothing, but what did she say? She yelled at him, pull, P-U-L-L. Pull is a command given to a horse. It means hurry up. This is no way you talk to someone that you love. Okay, I told you there were 3 newspapers published this time. One is The Economist, white supremacist newspaper. The other one is the North Carolinian, progressive Republican paper. And the other is Tar Heel, another conservative white supremacist Democratic paper that had just come into print recently. Now, here's something that surely interested Jim Wilcox, advertisement for an early automobile of some sort. This is 1900, and this is the first advertisement for a motor vehicle in a newspaper in Elizabeth City. But look how much they've improved in a year. This is 1901, and this is another early automobile. All of this fascinates Jim, no doubt. Well, now, as I said, Jim was a member of the volunteer fire department. And if you notice on the back row, second from the left, that is the Episcopal priest in Elizabeth City, Louis Llewellyn Williams. He always wore his clerical collar when he was fighting a fire. And he said the reason he did it was that if anyone was dying and wanted to confess or needed a last blessing, they could recognize him by his clerical collar. So he always fought fires with a clerical collar. Unfortunately, Jim is not in this picture, but he was a member of the fire brigade, which we know for a fact. Now, in the summer of 1901, late summer of 1901, Mr. Cropsey, who was a hulking man and had a fiery temper, he decided that he would rent this house called Seven Pines, which is down the street from the John B. Fearing house. Seven Pines, beautiful house, Queen Anne style, elaborate. It was designed by Elisha Overton, who was a Black architect. So the Cropseys were very comfortable here, no doubt. Jim had an easy walk from his house on Shepherd Street to Seven Pines, but I can't walk over and show you on the map because I'm stuck behind here. At any rate, it was a very straight walk. All he had to do was go down Shepherd Street, cross the swivel bridge, and then down Riverside Avenue to Seven Pines to go and visit Nell, which he visited her at least 3 times a week at night. And as I say, he worked at a marine railway. Here is one of the marine railways in Elizabeth City at the time. These were big operations and very important in that day. He spent everything that he had on Nell Cropsey. He bought gifts for her, very expensive gifts. He took her to plays. He took her to concerts. He took her roller skating. He did everything he could for her. Their relationship took a turn for the worse when the